"You ruined us," Dad screamed outside court. I handed the judge a 2015 scholarship letter in my name. It said, "Full ride." My parents went pale. I am Noah. I'm 28 years old, and my own parents sued me for stealing their retirement fund, which never existed. Before I tell you how a single forgotten online post from a decade ago blew their entire case apart in front of a judge, please tell me where you're watching from in the comments section. I'd like to see how far this story progresses. It all began after we had just completed a large software upgrade at work, and the office was filled with that distinct feeling of communal relief and accomplishment. For the first time in weeks, I departed before the sun had completely set. I was a senior software engineer who enjoyed the clean, logical world of code. You type a command, and it runs. There are rules. There is an order. It was a stark contrast to the impending upheaval in my life. Driving home, I felt a strong, pleasant sense of accomplishment. It was a feeling I'd been chasing for a decade. That morning, I made the final payment into my mortgage account, officially purchasing my first apartment, free and clear, years ahead of schedule. It wasn't a palace, just a one-bedroom condo in a good section of town, but it was my citadel. Every brick, every window was a tribute to years of ramen noodle dinners, missed vacations, and an unwavering dedication to a single goal: freedom. Financial, emotional, and complete independence. I walked into my flat with the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings still in the air. I dropped my keys into a ceramic bowl beside the door, a tiny but significant gesture. This was my bowl at home. I grinned as I looked around at the minimal furniture and boxes that I had yet to unpack. I made it. That evening, I had a little celebration. No fancy supper, no party. Just me, a giant pepperoni pizza steaming in its cardboard box, and a cold drink. I was seated on the floor, resting against the wall, scrolling through my phone, when the building intercom went off. A mail carrier delivered a certified letter. I needed to come down and sign for it. I assumed it was the county's final deed. More paperwork for the pile. I jogged downstairs, signed the electronic pad with a flourish, and carried the stiff, official-looking envelope upstairs. Back in my apartment, I opened it with my thumb. The letterhead was from Willocks, Crane & Associates, a law practice I had never heard of. My eyebrow wrinkled. I did not know any Willocks or Crane Associates. Then I noticed the first line. On behalf of our clients, Martin and Victoria Smith. The pizza in my stomach became lead. My parents. Why did they use a law firm to contact me? My gaze skimmed the paper, the legal language swirling before me. But some phrases came out rough and nasty. Breach of the verbal pact. Unjustified enrichment. Immediate repayment of parent plus student loans borrowed for your educational purposes. My heart began to beat frantically and painfully against my ribcage. I forced myself to continue reading, my breath caught in my throat. The letter methodically itemized loan disbursements for every semester I was in college, including fall 2015, spring 2016, and more. The total number was then displayed at the bottom of the page, which appeared to be impossible. $154,212, plus accrued interest. I reread the number, thinking my eyes were deceiving me. Couldn't be right. It was a sum huge enough to consume my entire life. Savings. Could absorb this entire flat. Could swallow me. But the final words broke my heart. It was not a request. It was a cold and deliberate threat. Failure to negotiate a payment plan within 30 days will result in legal action to collect assets, such as property liens and wage garnishments. Wage garnishment. Liens on property. They were coming for my home, which I had just completed paying for. They were coming for my salary, which I had worked so hard to obtain. I leaned back against the wall, the letter trembling in my grasp. The planet tipped on its axis. This was not a misunderstanding. The formality, legal wording, and 30-day deadline constituted a declaration of war. My own parents, who were meant to be my staunchest supporters, had just pointed a financial bazooka at my head and threatened to pull the trigger. I sat there for what seemed like hours. The pizza grew cold, while the beer warmed. The silence of my new empty house was no longer peaceful. It was oppressive, dominated by a single blaring question. Why? To comprehend the utter, earth-shattering shock of that letter, you must first understand the story my parents had built for me, which I had blindly embraced for 10 years prior. It was a story about their sacrifice, my compromise, and our collaborative endeavor. It was also an outright untruth. Let's go back a decade. I was 18, and my entire life spun around a single glimmering dream: Stanford University. It wasn't only about the prestige. I'd read about their engineering program, teachers, and culture of creativity. It felt like my mecca. I poured every ounce of me into my application. I forwent weekends for SAT prep, skipped parties for AP assignments, and wrote my application essay from the heart. I remember when the acceptance letter arrived. The envelope was thick and weighty, a good omen. My hands shook as I ripped it open in the driveway. The first word I saw was, "Congratulations." And a burst of pure, unadulterated delight escaped my throat. I ran inside, waving the letter like a victory flag. I got in. Mom, Dad, I got in, Stanford. The reaction was mild. It was the first red flag, but I was too high on adrenaline to notice it. My mother, Victoria, was putting flowers on the coffee table. She looked up with a tight, forced smile on her face. "Oh honey, that's wonderful." My father, Martin, was paying bills at his desk in the corner. He removed his reading spectacles and stroked the bridge of his nose, which I later learned indicated he was anxious or calculating. "Well, son," he continued, his voice thick, "that's a hell of an accomplishment. But we need to be realistic." "The letter mentions a generous financial aid package," I added, my delight turning to bewilderment. "They're offering a big scholarship." They sat me down at the kitchen table for what they referred to as a dose of reality. My father brought out a yellow legal paper and a calculator. "Okay, let's break this down," he said. He began scrawling numbers. He mentioned tuition, but then he included room and board, health insurance, holiday travel expenses, books, and supplies. He inflated every available cost, resulting in a scary mound of costs. "Look, Noah," my mother said, placing her hand on mine. Her hand was calm and kind, yet her words cut like a knife. "The scholarship is wonderful, a real honor, but it's a partial scholarship. Covers a good chunk, but there's still a huge gap. A gap we simply can't afford." I looked at the numbers on the legal pad. They appeared unreasonably high. "But are you sure?" I asked. "Maybe we can get loans. We don't want to saddle you with that kind of debt." "Honey," my father responded, shaking his head with paternal wisdom. "It would follow you for decades, and we can't co-sign. Our credit isn't good enough for a loan that big." Another falsehood. "The state university here," he said, tapping his pen on the table, "is an excellent engineering school. You can live at home. We can help you out, handle the paperwork, maybe take out a few small manageable loans in our name to make it easier. We'll be a team. We'll get you through it." I felt the dream end right there at the kitchen table. It was a quiet and agonizing death. I wasn't the only one disappointed. I felt humiliated. I felt as if I had failed. I'd gotten into the greatest school, but I hadn't done well enough to receive a full ride. I had put my parents in an embarrassing, stressful situation. I was a burden. "Okay," I muttered, my gaze fixed on the table. "Okay, the state school is fine." I believed them. I was 18. They were my parents. Why would they lie about such a thing? The second act of their play started later. My oldest brother, Blake, was a kind guy, but he was not an academic. He breezed through high school with B's and C's. My parents called a family meeting one night, their expressions gleaming. "We have incredible news," my mother declared. "Blake has been accepted to a prestigious private university on the East Coast." I was floored. "Wait, what? I thought we couldn't afford expensive schools?" My father pushed out his chest. "Well, your mother and I have been doing some creative financial planning. We've decided to make a significant investment in Blake's future. It's going to mean a lot of sacrifice for us. We'll have to put off retirement, maybe downsize the house later, but he deserves the best possible start." The hypocrisy was astounding. They could afford a full-fledged private school for him, but my Stanford goal was an unattainable luxury. I looked at Blake. He was staring at his shoes, a slight flush on his cheek. He knew. Even then he felt something was amiss. But he did not say anything. He accepted the present, which was built on the ashes of my dream. The following several years were a struggle. I enrolled at the local state university. To conserve money, I stayed at home in my childhood bedroom. My life was a repetitive cycle of school, homework, and employment. I found a job bussing tables at a greasy diner, with the aroma of old coffee and fried onions clinging to my clothes. On weekends, I worked at a warehouse, stocking big boxes as my muscles ached. I would return home fatigued, long after my parents had fallen asleep, and force myself to study for my engineering examinations. Meanwhile, Blake would call and text me. He would gripe about his hostile cuisine. He would tell me about his fraternity's ski vacation to Vermont. He shared photos from spring break in Cancun. He was having the quintessential college experience, thanks to my parents' huge sacrifice. Every day I had to swallow the bitter pill of resentment. But I channeled it. I used it for fuel. I promised myself that I would work so hard and achieve such success that I would never need anything from anyone again. So I did. I graduated at the top of my class. I got a terrific job. I got one promotion, then another. I was frugal with my money, saving every penny I could. Purchasing the flat was more than just a financial transaction. It was a proclamation of independence. It was the finish line for a long marathon. Now that I had that frightening letter, the marathon felt like a fake. The finish line had served as the starting gun for a new, more terrifying race. I needed an ally. I needed a professional. I called Rachel. We had been friends in college as part of a tiny, close-knit study group for a difficult thermodynamics class. She was extremely clever, with a mind capable of cutting through rubbish like a laser. After graduation, she attended a prestigious legal school. We hadn't talked in a few years, lost in the shuffle of pursuing our own jobs, but I knew she was the one. We met in a small coffee cafe downtown. I felt a rush of humiliation as I slipped the letter from my parents' lawyer across the table. It was like airing out my family's dirty linen. She read it, her demeanor changing from warm inquiry to hard professional concentration. She read it again, lips pursed. Parent plus loans, she finally added, lowering her voice. Nasty business. Legally, the debt belongs to the borrower, your parents. But they can, and often do, sue the student for repayment in civil court based on the idea of a verbal contract or unjust enrichment. It's your word against theirs. But there was no contract, I argued, my voice quivering. It's designed to be messy. They told me they were helping. They called it a gift. Rachel leaned forward, her gaze locked on mine. Noah, parents don't just wake up one day and decide to sue their son for $150,000 out of the blue. Something else is going on here. Something is missing. She stopped, then asked the question that would spark the entire investigation. Let's go back to the beginning. You got into Stanford. Tell me everything you remember about that scholarship. And I mean everything. I told the entire sad story. The huge packet. My parents' unusually restrained reaction, the legal pad with the inflated numbers, and their insistence that it was only a partial scholarship. Rachel listened intently, never leaving my face. After I finished, she remained silent for a whole minute, staring at the letter on the table. She then looked up at me. Noah. She began with precision and clarity. I'm going to ask you a very important question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Okay, I responded as my heart began to pound. Are you 100% certain it was a partial scholarship? Did you ever, with your own two eyes, see a document, a letter, an email from Stanford that explicitly stated the scholarship was partial? She leaned in closer. Or did you just take their word for it? The question lingered in the air, thick and menacing. I opened my mouth to provide the obvious response. Of course I accepted their word for it. They are my parents. But the words would not come out. My father took the acceptance letter from my hand, and he and my mother read it together with their heads lowered in conspiracy. I never had a good look at the financial aid area. I had just accepted their summation and verdict. A terrible sense of fear washed over me, as if my blood were freezing. It was the dizzying, nauseous sense of discovering that the ground you'd been standing on your entire life might not even be solid. I muttered, my voice barely heard. I don't know. I never checked. I just believed them. Rachel nodded slowly, her face stern. Then that, she said, touching the letter from the lawyers, is not the real battle. This is a symptom. The real battle is discovering what they were hiding from you 10 years ago, and we need to find out now. The days following my meeting with Rachel were filled with new, apprehensive energy. The cloud of shock and treachery began to lift, leaving behind the cold, piercing focus of a man on a mission. I was no longer simply a victim. I was an investigator, and the focus of my inquiry was my own life. My first step was to take Rachel's suggestion and become an archaeologist for my own past. I began with the state university I had previously attended. I called the financial assistance office again, this time with a more confident voice, and asked for a detailed history of my student loan accounts. The administrator was helpful, offering to assemble and transmit the records within a week. The next call was to Stanford, which I dreaded. It felt like reopening a wound that had never fully healed. My palm was sweating when I dialed the admissions office's number. After being transferred 3 times, I finally met a man in the scholarship awards department. I stated my case as properly as possible, indicating that I was involved in a legal battle and needed official proof of a scholarship offer from the spring of 2015. The man, Mr. Henderson, was pleasant, but seemed tired. Sir, that was a decade ago. Those records are in a deep archive, and our privacy policies are very strict. I can't release that kind of information over the phone based on a verbal request. My hope dwindled. Please, I pleaded, desperation oozing through my voice. This is incredibly important. It's not just about money. It's about getting to the truth. The person on the other end of the telephone let out a deep sigh. Look, he replied with a softer voice. I can't make any promises, but I'll see what I can dig up. If I find anything, I'll need a formal written request from you or your legal counsel. What was the name again? I gave him my details and hung up, feeling as if I had thrown a message in a bottle into a huge uninterested ocean. That evening, as if on cue, my phone rang. The caller ID indicated, Mom. My thumb hovered over the decline button, but morbid curiosity compelled me to answer. Her speech sounded like warm honey, a syrupy sweetness that sent off alarms in my head. Noah, darling, your father and I have been beside ourselves with worry. This whole business with the lawyers, it's just a terrible misunderstanding. They were far too aggressive. Why don't you come over for dinner tomorrow? Just the three of us. We can sort this all out like a family. The part of me that remained that 18-year-old guy, anxious for their acceptance, wanted to say yes. It wanted the nightmare to be a simple misunderstanding. But Rachel's voice was like a steel barricade in my head. They're not on your side. Each interaction is a calculation. I don't think that's a good idea, Mom, I replied, my voice flat. Don't be ridiculous, she chirped, her tone steady. We love you. We miss you. I'll make your favorite pot roast. Please, Noah. It would mean the world to your father. I consented against all of my instincts. I convinced myself it was a reconnaissance operation. I'd go. I'd listen. And I wouldn't give them 1 inch. I wanted to look them in the eyes and see if I could spot the liars hidden behind my parents' visage. The supper was a bizarre bit of theater. The house smelt like my childhood roast meat and memories. My father remained mostly mute, playing the role of the stoic, wounded patriarch. My mother was the star of the show. She didn't bring up the lawsuit explicitly. Instead, she took me on a tailored tour of my own history, taking out photo albums and pointing to images of a gap-toothed, smiling version of myself. Look how happy we were, she exclaimed, her eyes welling up with precisely timed tears. I just want to get back to this. We're not getting any younger, Noah. Your father's retirement account took a huge hit in the last recession. We're scared. The pivot was then smoothed out and practiced. She put her hand on mine. It felt cool. We know how successful you are now, honey, and we are so incredibly proud. We just need a little help to see us through. A little support from the son we gave everything to. That's not too much to ask, is it? It was a masterpiece in emotional blackmail. They were attempting to bury me in a landslide of guilt, believing that if I paid them, the feeling would end. I sat there, sliding the food around on my plate, my stomach in a tight, painful knot. I noticed the trap. I noticed the puppeteers pulling the strings. I murmured an explanation about an early meeting and rushed out the door, their sad sighs following me. When I got in my car, I called Rachel. It was a full court press of guilt, I informed her, grasping the driving wheel. They're trying to wear me down. Good, she said, her tone harsh. That's a desperation move. It means their legal position is weaker than they're letting on. Hold the line, Noah. We're waiting for our ammunition to arrive. A few days later, the first piece of ammunition arrived. A large envelope from the state university arrived. With shaky hands, I opened it. Inside came a detailed statement of my student loan account. And there it was, in bright black and white, 4 years of Parent Plus loans disbursed every semester, maxed out at the legal limit. The total was exactly what they had said. For a second, my heart fell. On paper, it was damning. I was ready to contact Rachel in a panic when I remembered her second piece of advice. I sat down at my computer and looked up the IRS rules for the American Opportunity Tax Credit for the years I spent in school. The AOTC was a large credit, providing up to $2,500 per year for eligible educational costs. The crucial term was expenses. You could only claim what you actually paid. This was the trickiest part. I needed to collect their tax returns. I contacted my father, my heart thumping. I pretended to be confused. Hey, Dad. My accountant is asking for some old records and he mentioned needing to know what educational credits were claimed when I was in school. Could you send me your tax returns from those years? Just for my records. There was a prolonged pause. Why? Would you need that, Noah? He inquired, his tone tinged with skepticism. I don't know, Dad. It's just what the accountant said. Something about making sure I don't get in trouble with the IRS down the line. It's no big deal, right? I held my breath. He grumbled, but ultimately consented. Fine, I'll have your mother scan them. An hour later, they arrived in my inbox. I forwarded them directly to Rachel. Her call arrived less than 20 minutes later. "Gotcha," she exclaimed, with a triumphant smile in her voice. "They claimed it every single year for the maximum amount. Noah, if they were paying with loan money, that's legal, but if that tuition was covered by a scholarship they knew about, they didn't just lie to you, they lied to the United States government. This is our leverage. This is big." It was a victory, but it felt disgusting. I was preparing a case against my own parents for tax fraud. Each piece of evidence revealed another weakness in the basis of my world. The following day, the second shoe dropped. An email arrived in my mailbox. The subject line read simply, "Stanford University follow-up." My breath caught. It came from Alan Carter, the current head of scholarship grants. He said that he had located the archived file. "Hi, Mr. Smith. Following up on your question, I have identified the archived file with your admission and scholarship offer. Per your request, I've attached a legally certified and notarized affidavit for your use. The document verifies that you, Noah Smith, have been awarded the G.H. Redmond Merit Scholarship. This was a full-ride award that covered all tuition, obligatory fees, lodging and board for 4 undergraduate years. Our records show that the official notification for this award was sent via email to the primary address indicated on your application, victoriasmith88@mail.com. I hope this information is helpful. We wish you well in resolving your issue. Sincerely, Alan Carter." I gazed at the screen, unable to process the words. Full-ride scholarship. Your tuition, lodging and board will be covered in full. My hand trembled when I clicked on the PDF attachment. There was an official paper with the Stanford University seal, outlining the reality in cold, undeniable legal language. They'd lied. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not an exaggeration. It was a huge, life-changing deception. They had buried a golden ticket to a future that I had won through hard work and intellect. They had allowed me to spend years working away, feeling like a second-class citizen, burdened by a failure that was never mine. They'd watched me struggle, knowing they had the key to my freedom in their inbox. And they did it so they could afford to send my brother to a prestigious school. And then, once their deception was complete, they had the audacity to sue me for the same money that the scholarship had saved them. The despair I had felt for months vanished. The bewilderment evaporated. In their place, an emotion I had never felt before arose. Pure, icy, diamond-hard rage. This was no longer about safeguarding my apartment or my income. This was about taking back a stolen past. This was about bringing justice to the 18-year-old child they had betrayed. I picked up my phone. My hand was completely steady. "Rachel," I replied when she responded. "I've got it." "The smoking gun." There was a slight pause. "Good," she replied, her voice harsh and ready. "Now we stop defending. Now we attack." Armed with Stanford's affidavit, I felt a wave of righteous power. I pictured going to court, delivering the document, and witnessing my parents' case disintegrate to dust. The truth was on my side. Victory felt unavoidable. But the legal system, as I quickly discovered, is not a truth machine. It is a grinder. And my parents' lawyer was excellent at feeding them rubbish. Rachel filed the affidavit along with a move to dismiss the lawsuit on the basis of fraud and misrepresentation. We sat back, expecting the nightmare to stop quickly. The letter we received was a masterpiece of legal evasion. Their lawyer did not question the affidavit's legitimacy. Instead, he crafted a new story around it. They stated they had never received the email from Stanford. It must have gone into their spam folder, like a digital ghost in the system. They contended that based on the reasonable premise that I only got a partial scholarship, they had a fiduciary duty as my parents to acquire the loans as a safety net. They were not lying, you see. They were simply responsible, loving parents prepared for the worst. They maintained that the stress and financial liability they incurred by signing those loans represented a type of assistance for which I was ethically and legally required to repay. It was bold. That was absurd. And it worked. The judge, a jaded guy who has probably seen every type of family drama, declined our motion to dismiss. He ruled that the question of my parents' knowledge and intent was a factual issue that needed to be decided at trial. The news was devastating. The final line I had envisaged had vanished, leaving behind a long, dark, and expensive road. The assurance I'd felt had been replaced by a growing, insidious fear. The case was not only ongoing, it was spreading. That's when my own personal storm started. The stress resulted in a persistent low-grade fever. It was the first thing I thought about when I awoke, and the last before I drifted into a fitful slumber. My work, once a haven of rationality and order, has become a battle. I'd stare at lines of code, but my head was in a trial, picturing my mother on the stand. I began losing weight, My friends would tell me I looked exhausted and haunted. My apartment, once a symbol of independence, began to seem like a cage. The legal bills from Rachel's firm were building up on my coffee table, a reminder of how much this was costing me. I was spending my savings to protect myself against a lie. The irony was as nasty as poison. One night, I reached my breaking point. I sat in the dark, staring at another bill, my gut tight with fear, and a nasty and enticing thought slipped into my thoughts. Simply pay them. I could end everything. I could phone their lawyer and propose a settlement. I could create a payment plan. I could defer a percentage of my salary for the next 20 years. It would be a surrender. It would represent a win for their lies. But the noise would stop. The legal bills would stop. The nagging, never-ending stress would finally stop. I could reclaim my life, albeit a degraded version of it. I took up the phone, my thumb hesitating over Rachel's contact information. I was about to phone her. I was going to tell her to draft the settlement. Paperwork. I intended to surrender. My parents had pushed me to the edge, and I was prepared to jump. I had a surge of deep self-loathing. They'd finally finished it. They'd broken me. As I sat there, buried in darkness and defeat, a random recollection emerged, like a glimmer of light in the abyss. It was a remembrance of my mother from many years ago. She wasn't the loving mother in the photo albums. She was the mother who would spend hours at night clacking away on the home computer's keyboard. She was infatuated with a certain online parenting community called College-Bound Parents. She had a username, a ridiculous, arrogant nickname, and she would spend hours giving advice, telling stories, and I later discovered, bragging. A small thought, hardly audible, flared in my head. What if she brags about it? It was a really long shot. A computerized Hail Mary. By this point, the forum was most likely a ghost town. The post would be gone in the digital ether. But there was something. It was a lone, weak thread in a world of sorrow. My heart started beating a little faster. The call to Rachel could wait. I rushed for my laptop and turned it on. My fingers, clumsy with a strange mix of optimism and desperation, entered the forum's name into the search field. There was still a digital remnant from a previous internet era. I found the search option. I remembered her username, a cringeworthy nickname that was so uniquely her. Proud Mom 8. I entered it and pressed enter. The page returned an error. The search feature was broken. The archives were outdated or corrupted. The flash of hope vanished as swiftly as it had appeared. Of course. It was a stupid concept. I sat back in my chair, the blackness creeping back in. But then my engineer brain took control. If the front door is locked, you can try the back window. There had to be another way to access outdated web pages. The Internet Archive. The Wayback Machine. My fingers moved across the keyboard again. I typed the forum's URL. A calendar arose, with images of the location captured over the years. I searched over the years for a window of time that was most important. I selected a date and held my breath. The page loaded agonizingly slowly, like a dial-up era ghost. It was a snapshot of the forum from that particular day. I began scrolling, my eyes burning from the screen's glare, looking for that one username. Page by page. Thread by thread. Parents are worried about their SAT scores. Parents are disagreeing about dorm room basics. It was an ocean of digital babble. Hours have passed. The clock on my screen moved forward. My body ached. My eyes felt like sandpaper. I was about to give up, drown in tiredness and defeat. And then I noticed it, nestled away in a sub-forum called College Admissions. The good, the bad, and the ugly. It was a thread. The discussion was titled, Dealing with an Unexpected Win. The username next to it is ProudMom88. My breath got locked in my throat. My heart pounded against my ribcage. It seemed as if the world had stopped spinning. With shaky fingers I clicked on the thread. The post was brief, only a few sentences. When I read the lines, the entire foundation of my parents' case crumbled. Their entire universe of falsehoods was demolished. The mood in the courtroom on the day of the trial was oppressive. The room was modest, wood-paneled, and smelled of old paper and stale air conditioning. I sat next to Rachel, my outfit feeling like a costume. My relatives had gathered across the aisle like a hostile delegation. My mother, Victoria, was dressed in a modest beige suit, exuding disgruntled motherhood. My father, Martin, sat ramrod straight with a stern expression. Behind them, my brother Blake appeared pale and uneasy, avoiding my gaze. Their lawyer, Redmond, was a shark in a $1,000 suit. He spoke first, and his opening statement was a symphony of trickery. He portrayed my parents as humble, hard-working individuals who had mortgaged their future for their children. He utilized terms like sacrifice, devotion, and the American dream. These are good people, he remarked, his voice ringing with deceptive sincerity. People who did everything for their son. And now that he is a successful engineer, enjoying a six-figure salary made possible by their sacrifice, all they ask is that he honor his commitment that he does the right thing. My mother delivered an outstanding performance on the witness stand. She wept softly while Redmond asked her a series of questions regarding their financial difficulties. She talked about sleepless nights, cutting coupons, and the crushing weight of the loans they took out for me. "We never wanted any of this," she said softly, blotting her eyes with a neatly folded tissue. "We just wanted him to acknowledge what we did. We gave him his future, and he's left us with nothing." It was devastatingly effective. I could sense the judge's sympathies move toward her. I felt my own case, my own reality, turn to sand and slip away from me. Then it was our turn. Rachel's approach provided a dramatic contrast. She remained cool, precise, and surgical. She summoned me to the stand and asked me to relate my version of events, my dream of Stanford, my parents' reality check at the kitchen table, and my 4 years of grinding through public university while working 2 jobs. Redmond's cross-examination was intended to humiliate me. "Mr. Smith," he began, his tone condescending, "are you genuinely asking this court to accept that a guy of your evident intelligence, much alone an engineer, never once bothered to independently evaluate the single most important cash offer of his young life? You simply accepted your parents' version of events?" "Yes," I replied, my voice clear and firm, staring directly at the judge. "Because they are my parents. And I trusted them." "A very convenient form of trust," Redmond sneered before settling in. Rachel approached the bench after I had stepped down. "Your Honor," she started, catching the room's attention. "The plaintiff's entire case is based on a claimed misunderstanding and memory. They maintain they never saw the email and acted in good faith. We would now like to present facts that will leave no question that this was not a misunderstanding. It was a purposeful, planned, and documented deceit." A big monitor facing the court and the witness stand came to life. "Your Honor," Rachel continued, "I am submitting a certified timestamped snapshot of the Internet Archive taken on April 28, 2015. The page comes from a public online community called College Bound Parents. I watched my mother's hand move to her pearls. Her face lost its color. My father gave her a look of utter wrath. The post in question is from a user with the handle ProudMom," Rachel remarked with a strong voice. "Mrs. Smith, can you please confirm for the court that this was your username on that forum?" My mother stared at her, silent. Her lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection. Relevance. This is a fishing expedition." "It is the most relevant piece of evidence in this entire case, Your Honor," Rachel said in response. "It goes directly to the plaintiff's knowledge and intent." "Overruled," the judge said, his gaze narrowing and focusing on my mother. "Mrs. Smith, answer the question." My mother swallowed, her throat straining. I may have used that name on a few websites," she stuttered. "Thank you," Rachel said, a sad smile on her lips. "Would the court clerk please read the highlighted post from user ProudMom8 aloud?" A great calm descended over the courtroom. The clerk fixed her glasses and proceeded to read, her voice clear and emotionless. "Unbelievable. My oldest has to struggle with loans to get into a good school, but my youngest just got a full free ride to California. He doesn't even know yet. Sometimes a parent has to make the tough calls for the good of the whole family." A collective gasp echoed across the gallery, and Redmond stood motionless, his mouth slightly agape. My father looked at my mother with such absolute betrayal that it was almost frightening. He had been a part of the deception, but it was plain he had no idea she had been so stupid as to document it. But Rachel wasn't done. She waited for the words to sink in before administering the fatal blow. "So, Mrs. Smith," she added quietly but clearly, "it appears you knew. You knew it was a whole free ride. And you took a difficult decision to withhold that life-changing chance from your own son, leading him to believe he had failed, and then suing him a decade later for money you never had to spend. Is this correct?" My mother simply gazed, her face a collapsing ruin. The judge had had enough and glanced down from his seat, his face filled with frigid disgust. "Mrs. Bonham Smith," he said, his voice dangerously low, "do you have anything to say in reaction to this revelation?" Before she could respond, the last pitiful piece of their conspiracy broke apart. My brother Blake, who had been shrinking in his seat, suddenly leaped to his feet. His face was blotchy, his eyes wild with fright, and he wasn't staring at me, but at our parents. "I told you it was a crazy idea," he yelled, his voice cracking with a decade of pent-up guilt and cowardice. "I warned you it would explode in our faces. I never asked for any of this." It wasn't an apology. It was a confession and acknowledgement that he knew he had been a quiet accomplice to their crime for his own gain. The trial was done. The truth had been detonated, not simply revealed, and my entire family had suffered as a result. The judge's gavel fell with a piercing, final crack that mimicked the disintegration of my family. He did more than just reject my parents' lawsuit. He openly demolished it piece by piece. "This court has witnessed a shocking and malicious campaign of financial and emotional fraud perpetrated by parents against their own child," he added, his voice frigid and angry, far more scary than shouting. He glanced down from his bench, his eyes roaming over my parents, who appeared to shrink in their chairs. "The claim is dismissed with prejudice," he said, implying that they could never try to bring this action again. "This court will not be used as a weapon for family extortion." He waited, allowing the weight of his words to sink in before delivering the blow that would change everything. "Furthermore," he said with a sterner voice, "based on the clear evidence of misrepresentation, the defendant's testimony, and the plaintiff's own documented admissions of deception, I am referring this entire matter to the Internal Revenue Service for an investigation into tax fraud, and to the District Attorney's Office for a review of potential criminal charges, including conspiracy and perjury." My mother made a slight coughing sound, and my father, who had maintained a tough facade throughout, suddenly cracked. He fell in his chair, his face ashen, as if he had just witnessed his entire world burn to the ground. They hadn't simply lost a case, they'd invited the entire crushing weight of the federal and state governments into their life, and their greed had become a self-destruct sequence. As the judge adjourned the court, a weird numbness overcame me. I'd won. The truth had prevailed. But there was no elation, no triumphant fist pump. Just a wide, hollow silence where my family had once been. Rachel put a soothing hand on my shoulder. "You did it, Noah," she whispered softly. "You faced them down, and you won." I could only nod. The words stayed in my throat. We collected our paperwork and walked out into the long, sterile courthouse hallway, and there they were, waiting for a broken, hostile scene. My father was the first to speak, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You've ruined us," he muttered, his eyes flaming with hatred. "Are you happy now? You've dragged your own family through the mud and destroyed everything." My mother stood behind him, her face contorted into a mask of pure malice. The sweet maternal facade was vanished, replaced by the hideous reality underneath. "We gave you life," she moaned. "We sacrificed everything for you, and you repay us with this betrayal. You are no son of mine." For many years, such comments would have been a death blow, sending me into a downward spiral of remorse, desperately attempting to repair what I had shattered, and pleading for their forgiveness. But something inside of me changed at that moment. The part of me that wanted their acceptance and feared their displeasure had died in that courtroom, replaced with a quiet, unwavering confidence. I glanced at my father, the weak man who permitted a monster, at my brother, the coward who benefited from her cruelty, and at my mother, the mastermind behind it all. "You have it backwards," I remarked, my voice unusually calm and steady. "I didn't destroy this family." "You did." I looked straight into my mother's eyes. "You ruined it in our kitchen 10 years ago when you decided my future was a commodity to be bargained over. You ruined everything each time you lied to me. You always made me feel inadequate while concealing the truth." I took a deep breath, and the words I had been meaning to speak for 10 years finally came out. "My achievement isn't your retirement plan. My successes are not for you to claim. And my life," I said, my voice dropping slightly, "is not yours to dictate. I loved the people I thought you were," I said, my words tasting like ash. "But they never really existed. I'm done trying to win the approval of ghosts." I kept their stare for a moment longer. Then I turned my back. I did not wait for a response. There was nothing left to say. I walked down the long hallway, past the security guards and metal detectors to the large glass doors that opened to the outer world. Each step represented a release. I was going away from the lies, manipulation, guilt, and 1,000 invisible strings that had been used to control me. I pulled open the doors and stepped out into the glaring, indifferent sunlight, and for the first time in my life, I experienced the profound, terrifying, and exhilarating lightness of complete and utter freedom. The months following the trial were marked by calm, careful reconstruction rather than celebration. You don't simply walk away from a building collapse unharmed. You must sift through the wreckage, tend to your wounds, and then gradually and cautiously begin building something new. My first step towards reconstruction was to sell the apartment. It was a lovely sight and my first major accomplishment, but it was tainted. The walls evoked too many memories of restless nights, pacing the floor with a phone to my ear and staring at stacks of legal documents representing my family's betrayal. It was no longer a home. It was the scene of the crime. I took a promotion at work that included a relocation package, a new city, a few states away, with no one knowing my name or tale. It was the perfect fresh start. I purchased a smaller condo that didn't shout, "I made it," but rather whispered, "I'm safe." It became my refuge. Life fell into a new, tranquil rhythm. My work was engaging. My co-workers admired me for my abilities, not for my heritage. I explored my new city, discovering a favorite coffee shop and a nice hiking track. I was establishing a life, not simply a career. One of the most surprising outcomes of the struggle was an invitation to speak at a tiny local TEDx event. A writer who covered local tech topics wrote an article on my case that focused on how I used the Internet Archive as a digital forensics tool to win, rather than the family drama. After reading the post, the event's organizer contacted us. The topic of their event was redefining value. They asked me to speak. I was afraid. But Rachel convinced me differently. "Your story isn't just about you, Noah," she had explained. "It's for everyone who has ever been made to feel small. For everyone who has ever had their worth questioned by the people who were supposed to build them up." So I agreed. I stood on that small platform beneath the bright lights, my heart pumping as I delivered my story. I didn't concentrate on the rage or the legal maneuvering. I discussed the invisible price tags that some families impose on their children. I discussed the courage it takes to craft your own tale. When I finished, the audience exploded with cheers. Afterwards, person after person approached me, not to give sympathy, but to tell their own stories. I recognized that my grief, which had once been a cause of shame, had transformed into a means of connecting with people. I stayed in touch with Rachel. Of course. She had become more than just my lawyer. She was the most loyal friend I had. She gave me the occasional depressing update. The IRS investigation had been, in her words, a financial colonoscopy. My parents were compelled to repay 10 years of bogus tax credits, along with heavy penalties and interest. It wiped out their meager money. They had to sell the family house where I grew up and relocate to a small rental flat. Their social circle, which was based on a veneer of middle-class respectability, dissipated once the trial became local news. Blake, my golden boy sibling, had his own reckoning. His prominent firm has a zero-tolerance ethical policy. Being named in a fraud and perjury inquiry, even as a witness who admitted his involvement on the stand, rendered him radioactive. He was quietly fired. My parents had stolen his expensive education, but it had brought him nowhere. I assumed that was the end of it. I believed the narrative had ended. I was healing. I was moving on. I'd even adopted a scruffy terrier mix from the local shelter. Max was a fellow victim who was learning to trust again. Life was silent. Then a package arrived. It was a little flat-rate box addressed to me in a handwriting I knew immediately. Blake's. My first thought was to put it in the garbage, unopened. What could he say to me? But a deeper, more cautious side of me took over, one that had learnt never to underestimate my family's proclivity for drama. I brought it inside and set it on my kitchen counter, staring at it like it was a bomb. After about an hour, I carefully cut it open. Inside, there was no sentimental waste, no outdated photographs. There was only a letter and a hefty stack of paperwork kept together with a binder clip. I read the letter first. This was not an apology. It was a confession made out of pure, sad self-preservation. "Noah, I know you despise me. I probably deserved it. What occurred has completely destroyed my life. I can't get a job. Dad and Mom won't even speak to me anymore. They accuse me of shouting in court. I have been doing a lot of thinking. I need to clear my conscience, but I also have to defend myself. The DA is still investigating this whole affair, and I do not want to be charged as a co-conspirator. The documents you need to examine are enclosed, and they show the entire truth. It was worse than you expected. Blake." My blood became chilly. Worse? How could it possibly go worse? I scooped up the stack of documents. These were brokerage account statements. The account was formed in Blake's name during the summer, when I was due to start at Stanford. Then I saw it. The initial deposit. $250,000. I stared at the number, my mind trying to connect the dots. Where did they obtain that much money? I looked at the date, and suddenly I understood. Stanford's annual tuition, housing and board costs were projected to be around $62,500 at the time. When multiplied by 4, the total was exactly $250,000. My parents had not merely saved the money from my scholarship. That was the story I'd pieced together. The one I assumed was the truth. But the reality was far more diabolical. They went to a financial advisor, presented my full-ride scholarship as if it were a grant, and took out a portfolio loan to cover the cost of my 4-year education. They had commercialized my future. They had converted my accomplishment into dollars. The statement spelled forth the entire, horrible scenario. They transferred that $250,000 to a brokerage account in Blake's name, making him the legal owner and direct accomplice. They utilized the money as a slush fund. I observed these withdrawals. Tuition payments to Blake's private university, a down payment for my father's new automobile, a vacation in Hawaii. The worst element, which made me literally nauseous, was their investment approach. They had not been conservative. They had invested the money in high-risk speculative technology stocks, intending to profit off my stolen future. For a while, it worked. The account expanded. Then followed the crash. I witnessed the horrific losses. The panic trade. The value evaporates. More than 80% of the initial money was depleted. And then everything clicked into place. The case was not motivated solely by vengeance. It was a desperate, mad attempt to make up for their losses. They weren't suing me over the money they spent on me. They were suing me for the seed money they had stolen in my name and then gambled with. They believed, in their twisted imaginations, that the first $250,000 was rightly theirs, and I was the insurance policy to recover it. I dropped the papers on the counter. The room felt like it was spinning. All this time, I believed I'd discovered the truth. But I'd just scratched the surface. This wasn't simply about dishonesty and family favoritism. This was intentional, premeditated deceit on a scale I could not have predicted. They hadn't simply hidden my fantasy from me. They sold it to the highest bidder and then lost the money in the casino. Blake's letter was not a statement of conscience. It was self-preservation. He was throwing our parents under the bus to defend himself, providing me ammunition to make sure he didn't take the blame. I strolled up to the sliding glass door and gazed out at the city lights. I didn't feel angry anymore. That sentiment was too little and simple for this. What I felt was incredible. Chilling clarity. A complete comprehension of who these people were. They were not simply imperfect, selfish parents. They were crooks who saw their own son as nothing more than a financial asset, a bearer bond to be cashed in. At that moment, any remaining uncertainty about whether I did the right thing was destroyed forever. I wasn't the one who wrecked my family. There wasn't a family to destroy. There was only one criminal business with a common last name. And I had finally, thankfully, escaped. I've realized that peace is not a destination. It's a peaceful area you create for yourself, one day at a time, especially after discovering that the fight you thought you'd won was only one battle in a much longer, uglier struggle. For me, tranquility is the stillness of an early morning, sitting on my modest balcony with a warm cup of coffee, watching the city slowly come alive. It's the cheerful, rhythmic clicking of Max's nails on the hardwood floor as he comes over to push my palm with his favorite squeaky toy. It's the basic, uncomplicated thrill of finally living my own life. Do I still think of them? Yes. But things are different now. After receiving Blake's delivery, the narrative in my thoughts changed from tragedy to case study. The rage I felt during the trial has subsided into something else. It is the cold, hard certainty of an investigator who has finally solved a lengthy, difficult case. I no longer grieve for the family I should have had. I see them as they are. People whose moral compass was so damaged that they saw their son's victory, not as a reason to celebrate. However, it is considered an asset that must be liquidated. Blake's final revelation was a strange, bitter gift. It fully cauterized the wound. There are no further questions. No more lingering doubts. I understand now. The case was not filed only for spite. It was a desperate attempt by failed gamblers to have the casino reimburse their losses. I was their final desperate bet. In light of such a devastating betrayal, I've been forced to reframe what forgiving is. It is not about absolving them. What they did was not simply a falsehood, it was a crime. It is not about reopening the door to my life. That door is not only locked, it has been removed, and the doorway has been bricked over. For me, forgiving has been the act of fully acknowledging the reality, no matter how unpleasant, and then intentionally determining that their story will no longer be mine. It is about giving up on the idea that they will ever feel remorse, because people like that do not feel guilt for their actions, only for being caught. Forgiveness is about regaining control. They are greedy. They are desperate. They're anarchy. It cannot reach me here. I'm no longer a character in their dark, twisted story. I am an author on my own. and I have decided to compose a story of peace. The other day, I was unloading the final box from my move. At the bottom, I found a copy of Stanford's notarized affidavit, that single piece of paper that had previously served as both my sword and shield. I assumed the document had the ultimate truth. For a brief time, I considered framing it as a prize from my biggest battle. But then I remembered the brokerage statements Blake had sent me. That was the actual truth, the final ugliest chapter, and I realized I didn't want a wartime trophy on my wall. I didn't want any reminders of the darkness. I looked up to the main wall of my living room. I have a large framed photograph from last month hanging there. It's a picture of Max and me at the top of a hiking trail, looking out over a big green valley. We're both slightly muddy. The sun is bright. And I am laughing. This is not the nice, guarded smile from my old family portraits, but a wild, unrestrained laugh of pure, undiluted freedom. I took the affidavit and copies of the brokerage statements. I took them to the shredder at my home office and fed them through one by one. I watched as the truth of their crimes faded into meaningless confetti. The scholarship affidavit described a war I was obliged to fight. The financial statements told the story of a crime that I was fortunate to uncover. But what about the photograph on my wall? That is the story of the life I intend to live. A life built without duty or debt. Not on stolen futures or broken trust. But on loyalty and delight, and a tranquility I've earned one solitary morning at a time. Thank you for hearing my story. I hope it touched you in some way. Have you ever learned a fact that was worse than you expected? And how did you find peace afterwards? Share your story in the comments section below. I've read them all. Don't forget to like and subscribe to avoid missing out on what comes next.